The room smelled of antiseptic and old grief. Arthur Volkov lay in the hospital bed, a statue carved from granite and regret. For 3 weeks, he had not spoken a word. Not since the fire and the screaming and the betrayal that had put him here. The doctors called it selective mutism, a trauma response. They scribbled notes on their clipboards, their faces a mixture of pity and professional curiosity. They did not know who he was. To them, he was Mr. Petrov, a retired bookseller with no family and a nasty case of smoke inhalation. A fiction. A necessary lie to keep the wolves from the door. But Arthur knew the truth. He was not silent because he could not speak. He was silent because he was listening. He was watching. In his world, the world he had built with blood and fear, silence was a weapon. It was a shield. It made people uncomfortable. They filled the void with their own nervous chatter, their plans, their weaknesses. So he lay still, his grey eyes missing nothing from the fortress of his pillow. He watched the nurses come and go. He saw the bored ones, the rushed ones, the ones who saw him as a task on a checklist. Then there was her. Her name was Ilara, according to the tag pinned to her pale blue scrubs. She was different. She was silent, too. She moved through the sterile room with a quiet grace, her hands efficient and gentle as she checked his vitals, adjusted his drip. She never tried to coax a word from him. She never offered empty platitudes or forced cheerfulness. Instead, she communicated with a small, worn whiteboard that hung from a lanyard around her neck. "Time for your medication, Mr. Petrov. Do you need another blanket? The doctor will be in soon." Her eyes, a deep and weary brown, did the real talking. They held a universe of understanding that the noisy world outside could never comprehend. One afternoon, she came in to change his bandages. She worked with her usual focused calm. But something was wrong. A slight tremor in her hands. A shadow in those expressive eyes that had not been there the day before. As she leaned over him, the sleeve of her scrub slid up her arm. Just for a second. But he saw it. A constellation of purple and blue marks on her wrist, shaped like fingers. Someone had gripped her. Hard. Her gaze met his, and for a fleeting moment, the mask of professional calm slipped. He saw pure, undiluted fear. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, her cheeks flushing. She finished her work, gave him a small, tight nod, and left the room without writing a single word on her board. Later that night, he heard voices in the hallway. One was a man's, a low, greasy snarl. The other was a choked, desperate sound. A sob. Arthur's eyes snapped open. He slid slowly, painfully, to the edge of his bed. The door was cracked open just enough. He saw Ilara, pressed against the wall. A man loomed over her, a thick, brutish figure with a cheap suit and cheaper cologne that fouled the antiseptic air. "The deadline was yesterday, sweet thing," the man rasped, his voice a weapon. "My boss ain't a patient man." Ilara shook her head frantically, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. "Don't give me that," the man sneered. "You got a job. You get paid. Where's the money?" He grabbed her arm. The same arm with the bruises. She flinched, a silent scream in her eyes. Arthur watched, his blood turning to ice, then to fire. In that moment, the quiet nurse with the sad eyes was no longer just a nurse. She was a symbol of every innocent person the jackals of the world tried to devour. And the man in the cheap suit was no longer just a man. He was a violation. A transgression against a code Arthur held more sacred than any law. You do not harm those who cannot fight back. You do not prey on the weak. The man gave Ilara a little shake. "I'll be back tomorrow. Have it. Or the next time I visit your little brother, I won't just be bringing him candy." He released her with a shove and swaggered down the hall. Ilara crumpled against the wall, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She thought she was alone. She was wrong. From the shadows of the hospital room, a pair of cold, grey eyes watched her, and for the first time in 3 weeks, a decision formed behind them that had nothing to do with listening, and everything to do with action. The old lion was awake. And he was hungry. Stay with me until the end, because what this silent old man does next is not just an act of kindness, it is an earthquake that will shatter the lives of everyone who dared to mistake his silence for weakness. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing how far our stories travel. Now, let's get back to it. Arthur Volkov was not a good man. He had never pretended to be. Good men did not build empires from the rubble of their rivals. Good men did not have names that were whispered in back alleys and boardrooms with the same mixture of reverence and fear. His hands, now resting calmly on the thin hospital blanket, had signed orders that ended careers, families, lives. He was a product of a harsh world, a cold city that chewed up the weak and spat out the bones. He had learned its lessons early. The first lesson, power is the only currency that never loses its value. The second, trust is a luxury you can only afford to place in a very small circle. The third, and most important, have a code. Without a code, you were just a thug. A beast. Arthur's code was simple, brutal, and absolute. You protect your own. You honor your word. And you never, ever, touch women or children. They were outside the game. They were civilians in a war they had not signed up for. To violate that rule was to invite a wrath that was biblical in its scope and finality. This man in the hallway, this greasy parasite, had just broken Arthur's most sacred rule. He had brought the ugliness of the street into a place of healing. He had put his hands on a woman who was the very definition of defenseless. A woman whose only crime was her quiet compassion. Arthur's mind drifted back, years ago, to another quiet woman. His wife, Anya. She had had a voice like wind chimes, soft and gentle, a stark contrast to the grating harshness of his own world. She had been his anchor, his humanity. The cancer had taken her voice first, reducing her to whispers, then to notes scribbled on a pad by her bedside. He had sat with her for months, learning to understand the language of her eyes, just as he now understood Ilara's. He had felt helpless then, a king with an empire of power, unable to fight the one enemy that could not be threatened, bribed, or broken. When Anya was gone, a part of him had gone silent forever. Now, seeing Ilara's terror, that old, cold helplessness threatened to rise again. But this was different. This was not a disease. This was a man. And men could be dealt with. He looked over at the chair in the corner of his room. Mikhail sat there as he had every day for 3 weeks, reading a worn paperback novel. To the hospital staff, he was Mr. Petrov's devoted nephew. In reality, Mikhail was Arthur's right hand, his shadow, his memory. He was the only person on earth Arthur trusted without reservation. Mikhail had been a scared, skinny orphan on the streets before Arthur had found him, had seen the fierce loyalty burning in his eyes, and had taken him in. Now, he was a man who could command a small army with a single nod, a man whose placid face concealed a mind like a steel trap. Arthur watched Ilara finally push herself off the wall, straighten her scrubs, and wipe her eyes. She took a deep, shuddering breath, pasted on a fragile mask of composure, and continued her rounds. A soldier. In her own way, she was as tough as any man he had ever known. He admired her for it. And that admiration sealed the fate of the man in the cheap suit. Arthur shifted his weight in the bed, the slight rustle of the sheets enough to make Mikhail look up from his book. Their eyes met across the dim room. For 3 weeks, Arthur had given no orders, shown no sign of the man he was. He had been a patient. Nothing more. Now, he lifted his hand, just a fraction of an inch, and crooked his finger. "Come here." Mikhail's face remained impassive, but his eyes sharpened. He put a bookmark in his novel, placed it carefully on the bedside table, and rose. He moved with the silent economy of a predator, crossing the room and leaning down, his ear close to Arthur's mouth. He expected a whisper. A pained, raspy sound. He had not heard his boss's voice since the night of the fire. The silence stretched. Arthur's lips barely moved. He uttered a single word. A name. Ilara. The voice was a ghost, a dry crackle of sound, but it was there. It was a command. Mikhail's expression did not change, but a flicker of understanding, and perhaps surprise, passed through his eyes. He had seen the nurse. He had seen the bruises. Mikhail saw everything. But he had assumed it was not his place to comment, not his business to bring it to the boss's attention. He had misjudged. He had forgotten that for Arthur, some things were always his business. Mikhail nodded once, a short, sharp gesture. He understood. The object of concern was the nurse. The problem was the man in the hallway. The solution was whatever Arthur decided it would be. Arthur's mind was already working, the rusty gears of strategy and command beginning to turn. He had been dormant, but he had not been asleep. The first step was information. Who was this girl? What was her story? What kind of trouble was she in, and who was the architect of that trouble? He needed the full picture before he could act. Recklessness was for amateurs and fools. Precision was for kings. He met Mikhail's gaze again. He mouthed two words. Her story. Mikhail gave another almost imperceptible nod. He knew what that meant. It meant using their resources, their eyes and ears throughout the city, to paint a complete portrait of Nurse Ilara. Her family, her friends, her debts, her fears. Everything. Then, Arthur mouthed another two words. The man. This command was different. It carried a colder weight. It meant finding the parasite in the cheap suit. It meant learning his name, his habits, his associates, and most importantly, the name of the man he answered to. You never just swatted a fly. You found the filth that was attracting them and you burned it out. Mikhail straightened up. I will handle it, he said, his voice a low murmur that would not carry past the door. He walked to the window and pulled out his phone. He began to type a series of rapid, coded messages, his thumbs a blur. The machinery of Arthur Volkov's hidden empire was stirring to life. Spiders in a vast web, feeling the twitch of a single thread from their master in the center. Arthur leaned back against his pillows, his energy spent. Speaking, even that one word, had felt like tearing something inside him. But it was a good tear. A necessary one. He was tired of being a patient. He was tired of being a victim. The fire had been meant to end him. A betrayal from within his own ranks, an ambitious captain named Petrovich who had grown impatient. Arthur had survived, but the world thought him either dead or broken. It was an illusion he had been content to maintain. Until now. Petrovich could wait. His treason would be answered in due time, with a cold and personal fury. But this matter, the matter of the silent nurse and the brute in the hallway, this was immediate. This was a question of principle. An hour later, Ilara came back into the room. She carried a small tray with a cup of water and his nightly pills. Her face was composed, her movement steady. If you did not know what to look for, you would never guess the storm raging inside her. But Arthur knew. He saw the slight redness around her eyes. He saw the tension in her shoulders. He saw the way she avoided looking directly at him, as if her own fear was a shameful secret she did not want him to see. She set the tray down and held up her whiteboard. Good evening, Mr. Petrov. He looked at the words, then back at her face. For weeks, he had been a blank slate to her, a silent old man lost in his own trauma. He wondered what she saw when she looked at him. Did she see a broken thing to be pitied? Or did she, in that silent way of hers, sense something more? He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched her arm, just above the wrist where the bruises were hidden. It was not a grab. It was a gesture. A question. Her eyes widened in surprise. She froze. He held her gaze, and tried to pour all the things he could not say into that single look. I see you. I know. You are not alone. A single tear escaped her eye and traced a path down her cheek. She did not pull away. She simply stood there, her arm under his hand, and for the first time, she let him see the full extent of her despair. In that moment, a bond was forged between them. A silent pact. He was her patient, and she was his nurse. But they were also something more. They were two voiceless people in a world that was too loud, who had found a flicker of understanding in the quiet. Arthur felt a forgotten emotion stir in his chest. A fierce, paternal protectiveness. It was the same feeling he'd had for his daughter before she had grown up and moved away, building a life as far from his as she could get. He had let his daughter go, to protect her from his world. He would not make the same mistake of inaction again. He released her arm and pointed to the chair where Mikhail had been sitting. Then he pointed to himself. He tapped his chest. His meaning was clear. He is with me. He is my family. And then he did something he had not done in years. He made a promise with his eyes. He looked from the chair to her, and then gave a slow, deliberate nod. Help is coming. Ilara stared at him, her brow furrowed in confusion, but also with a dawning glimmer of hope. She did not understand. How could this broken, silent old man help her? But something in his gaze, a hardness, a certainty she had never seen before, made a small part of her want to believe. She wiped her tear away with the back of her hand, picked up her whiteboard, and wrote a new message. Thank you, Mr. Petrov. She gave him a watery, grateful smile, administered his medication, and left the room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and his resolve. The decision was made. There was no turning back. This was no longer about business. This was about a debt. Not a debt of money, but of kindness. She had cared for him when he was at his weakest, offering a quiet dignity that no one else had. Now, he would repay her. He would use the very thing she was a victim of, fear, and turn it into her shield. He would remind the city's predators that there were still old gods sleeping in their midst. And that it was a fatal mistake to wake them. Mikhail returned just before dawn. He moved like a ghost, materializing at Arthur's bedside. He held out his phone. On the screen was a detailed report. Arthur took it, his old eye scanning the text in the dim light. Her name was Ilara Morozova. 26 years old. Her parents were gone. She had one living relative, a younger brother, Leo, aged 10. Leo had cystic fibrosis. He was on a waiting list for a lung transplant, a procedure with a staggering cost. Ilara worked 2 jobs to cover his medical bills and their small apartment's rent. She had been a singer, the report said. Classically trained. She had performed in small clubs, her voice a local legend. 2 years ago, she had been walking home from a performance when she was attacked. The assault had damaged her vocal cords beyond repair. The police had never found the man responsible. After that, she had given up music and enrolled in nursing school. To heal others, because she could not heal herself. Arthur's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone. The debt was not from a bad decision or a gambling problem. It was the crushing weight of a broken healthcare system, a burden she had taken on for her brother. She had borrowed money from a loan shark. A man named Rico. The man from the hallway. The report included a picture of him. A cheap thug with a smug look and dead eyes. He worked for a mid-level operator named Sal Mark I. Mark I was not part of Arthur's organization. He was an independent, a vulture who specialized in preying on the desperate. He had no code. No honor. Which meant he had no protection. Arthur scrolled down further. Mikhail had been thorough. He had Rico's address. His daily routine. The location of the seedy back office where he conducted his business. He also had a location for Sal Mark I. A warehouse down by the docks that he used for his less savory operations. Arthur handed the phone back to Mikhail. The internal debate was over. There was no conflict between his code and his compassion. Here, they were one and the same. His duty was clear. He looked at Mikhail, his expression grim. He raised one finger. Phase 1. He made a writing gesture in the air. Mikhail understood. He pulled a small notepad and a pen from his pocket. Arthur began to give his orders, not with his voice, but with the pen. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were sharp and clear. The boy. Leo. Top of the transplant list. Now. Use the hospital foundation. My anonymous donation. Mikhail read it and nodded. Money was the easiest part of the problem to solve. A few calls, a wire transfer from a shell corporation, and a 10-year-old boy's life would be saved. It was a power Arthur rarely used for good, but when he did, it moved mountains. Next, he wrote again. Her debt. Pay it. In full. Anonymously. Use a lawyer. A charitable grant. Mikhail nodded again. This would also be simple. But Arthur was not finished. These actions would solve Ilara's problems, but they would not deliver justice. They would not remove a cancer. They would only treat the symptoms. He gripped the pen tighter. The man. Rico. I want him. Mikhail's eyes narrowed slightly. This was the part of the job he understood best. And his boss. Mark 1. Arthur underlined the name twice. The warehouse. Tonight. Bring them both. He paused, then added one final, chilling instruction. Leave one of their men. The weakest one. Let him run back to whoever is left. Let him tell the story. A message had to be sent. The city had to be reminded that there were lines you did not cross. Mikhail took the note, folded it, and put it in his pocket. It was a death warrant. Consider it done, he said softly. He then looked at Arthur, a question in his eyes. And you? He asked. Arthur pointed at his fur drip, then made a pulling motion. He pointed at his hospital gown, then made a gesture for clothes. Mikhail's face remained neutral, but his surprise was evident. You are not well enough, he stated. It was not a suggestion, it was a fact. Arthur's eyes flashed with the old fire. He did not need to be well. He just needed to be there. This was personal. He would deliver the sentence himself. He wrote one last time on the pad. Get my suit. Mikhail held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a slow nod of acquiescence. There was no arguing with Arthur Volkov when he had that look in his eye. The lion was not just awake. He was leaving his cage. Mikhail left the room to set the plan in motion. The plan itself was brutally simple. There would be no elaborate strategy. Mark I and his ilk did not warrant it. This would be an exercise in overwhelming force. A swift, silent, and terrifying display of power. Two of Mikhail's men, dressed as city maintenance workers, disabled the security cameras around Rico's apartment building. Another two, in a black sedan, waited for him to emerge for his morning collection rounds. It was over in seconds. The sedan boxed in Rico's car. Before he could even process what was happening, his doors were open, and he was being pulled from the vehicle, a black hood thrown over his head. He was bundled into the sedan and gone before the first pedestrian had a chance to look up from their phone. Saul Mark I was more difficult, but not by much. He was paranoid, as men in his line of work tended to be. He never met anyone inside his warehouse. He always conducted business from his armored car outside, while his men stood guard. Mikhail did not bother with subtlety. At 3 p.m., as Marcone's car was idling by the docks, a large, unassuming delivery truck pulled up and parked, blocking him in. Before Marcone's driver could even honk the horn, the back of the truck rolled up. Inside were 6 of Arthur's best men, dressed in black tactical gear, armed with silenced weapons. Marcone's guards never even had a chance to draw their own guns. They were neutralized with cold, ruthless efficiency. One man, the youngest and most terrified-looking of the bunch, was deliberately left untouched. He simply stood there, frozen in shock, as Mikhail's men breached the armored car and dragged a screaming Sal Mark I into the truck. "Go," one of the men said to the young guard, his voice flat and emotionless. "Tell everyone what you saw. Tell them the Volkov Syndicate sends its regards." The young man did not need to be told twice. He ran, and he did not look back. Back at the hospital, Arthur was preparing for his own part in the night's events. Mikhail had returned with a dark, impeccably tailored suit. With Mikhail's help, Arthur slowly, painfully, got dressed. He felt a searing pain in his ribs with every movement, but he ignored it. Pain was an old friend. He stood before the small mirror in the bathroom, looking at his reflection. He looked older. Thinner. The fire had stolen some of his vitality. But his eyes were the same. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss and had not blinked. He was ready. Mikhail helped him into a wheelchair, a necessary concession to his weakness, and they left the room. A doctor tried to stop them at the nurse's station. "Mr. Petrov, you cannot discharge yourself. It's against medical advice." Mikhail produced a thick envelope of cash and placed it on the counter. "The medical advice has been noted," he said calmly. "And declined." The doctor looked from the money to the cold expression on Mikhail's face and decided it was a battle he was not going to win. As they passed down the hall, they saw Ilara. She was at a computer, charting. She looked up, her eyes wide with shock to see him dressed, in a wheelchair, leaving. She rushed over, her whiteboard bouncing against her chest. "Where are you going? You are not well." Arthur offered her a small, tired smile. He reached into his suit pocket and pulled out the notepad and pen. He wrote a simple message and showed it to her. "I have some business to attend to. I will be back." It was a lie, of course. He would never return to this hospital. But it was a kind lie. Her eyes filled with a genuine concern that touched him deeply. She looked from him to Mikhail, as if pleading with him to stop this foolishness. Mikhail simply shook his head. Arthur reached out and patted her hand. "Thank you for everything, Ilara." He wrote it, but he hoped she could see the truth of it in his eyes. She had done more for him than she could ever know. She had reminded him of who he was supposed to be. Mikhail pushed the wheelchair toward the elevator, leaving Ilara standing alone in the hallway, a portrait of confused concern. The warehouse was cold and damp, smelling of rust and seawater. Rico and Sal Mark I were tied to chairs in the center of the vast, empty space, lit by a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. They were bruised, terrified, and utterly confused. They had no idea who had taken them, or why. Then, the large metal doors groaned open. A black car drove into the warehouse and stopped. Mikhail got out of the driver's side, opened the back door, and helped Arthur out of the car and back into his wheelchair. He pushed the chair slowly, deliberately, across the concrete floor until it came to a stop in front of the two terrified men. Mark I stared at the old man in the wheelchair. He saw a frail, sick patient. He did not recognize him. "Who the hell are you?" Mark I blustered, trying to project an authority he no longer had. "Do you know who I am?" Arthur did not answer. He just looked at them, his grey eyes as cold as a winter grave. He looked at Rico, the cheap thug who thought terrorizing a nurse was a sign of strength. He looked at Mark I, the rat who had built a kingdom on the misery of good people. Mikhail stepped forward. "You are in the presence of Arthur Volkov," he said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. The name hit the room like a physical blow. All the blood drained from Sal Markone's face. He began to tremble. "Volkov," he stammered. "But you're dead. Everyone knows you're dead." Arthur allowed himself a small, chilling smile. He had learned that the rumors of his demise had been greatly exaggerated. "I had business with you," Mark I pleaded, his voice cracking. "We never crossed paths. I stayed out of your way. I swear it." Arthur raised a hand, and Mikhail fell silent. The old man leaned forward in his chair, the effort causing him to wince in pain. He locked his eyes on Rico. For the first time that night, Arthur Volkov decided to speak. His voice was a raw, painful rasp, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "The nurse," he said, each word an effort. "Ilara Morozova." Rico's eyes widened in disbelief. This was about the mute nurse. This whole army, this legendary ghost of a gangster, all for her. It made no sense. She owed money, Rico stammered. It was just business. Business, Arthur repeated, the word a curse on his tongue. "You put your hands on her," he rasped, his voice gaining a terrifying strength. "In a hospital. A place for the sick. For the weak." He turned his gaze to Mark I. "And you? You let him. You profit from this filth." "I didn't know." Mark I cried. "If I had known she was connected to you, I would have never." "She is not connected to me," Arthur interrupted, his voice like grinding stone. "She is connected to nothing. She is a good woman trying to save her family. And that is why you are here." He leaned back, exhausted. He had said what he needed to say. "In this city," he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "there are rules. I did not make them, but I enforce them. You do not touch civilians. You do not harm women. You broke the rules." He looked at Mikhail. "Her debt has been paid," Arthur stated. "Her brother's medical care is secured for life. She will never have to worry about money again." He then gave his final verdict. "But a debt of honor remains. And it must be paid, too." He gave Mikhail a slight nod. That was all it took. "Your operations are now my operations," Mikhail said to the terrified Mark I. "Your assets are now my assets. Your lives are forfeit." Arthur turned his wheelchair around. He did not need to see the rest. Mikhail pushed him back toward the car as his men stepped out of the shadows. The permanent resolution was swift and silent. The next morning, Ilara arrived at the hospital for her shift. She felt a strange sense of loss when she saw the empty bed in Mr. Petrov's room. She knew he was gone, but she had hoped to see him one last time. At the nurse's station, a man in an expensive suit was waiting for her. He introduced himself as a lawyer from a charitable foundation. He informed her that an anonymous benefactor had established a trust in her brother's name. It would cover all of his medical expenses, including the transplant, for the rest of his life. He then handed her another envelope. Inside was a cashier's check made out to her, for the exact amount of her debt to Rico, plus enough to live comfortably for years. Ilara stood there, stunned into silence, the papers trembling in her hand. It was impossible. A miracle. Later that day, she got a call from the hospital's transplant coordinator. A perfect match had been found for Leo. He was being scheduled for surgery the following week. Ilara broke down and cried, not with fear or despair, but with a tidal wave of overwhelming relief and gratitude. She never heard from Rico again. She never saw the man in the cheap suit again. It was as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth. A week later, after her brother's successful surgery, she was leaving his room when a man she recognized approached her. It was Mr. Petrov's nephew, Mikhail. He was holding a single white rose. "This is from my uncle," he said, his face unreadable. "He wanted to make sure you and your brother were well." Ilara took the rose, her heart pounding. She quickly took out her whiteboard. "Who is he?" She wrote, her hand shaking. "Who is your uncle?" Mikhail looked at the question for a long moment. "He is a man who believes in paying his debts," he said finally. He then reached into his pocket and handed her a small, plain business card. On it, there was only a single phone number. "If you or your brother ever need anything, for the rest of your lives," Mikhail said, "you call this number. It will be answered." That is his promise. Ilara stared at the card, then up at Mikhail. She had one more question. A question that had been burning in her mind all week. She erased her board and wrote again. "Is he a good man?" Mikhail almost smiled. It was a fleeting, sad expression. "No," he said, his voice soft. "He is not a good man." He paused. "But for you, and for your brother, he was the right one." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Ilara standing in the quiet hospital hallway, holding a white rose, a promise of lifelong protection, and the confusing, terrifying, and beautiful truth that sometimes a savior can be found in the deepest of shadows. 5 years passed. The city moved on, as cities do. The name Sal Marquand was forgotten, a footnote in the annals of the underworld, a cautionary tale whispered by those who remembered. The Volkov syndicate, under the quiet and steady hand of Arthur, grew stronger, more disciplined. The betrayal that had almost cost him his life was avenged, not with fire and noise, but with a cold, silent dismantling of everything his rival had built. Arthur Volkov never returned to a life of public power. He remained a ghost, a legend. He ran his empire from the study of a secluded estate, far from the city's grime. He still did not speak much. He had found that he preferred the quiet. Ilara moreover thrived. Her brother, Leo, was a healthy, vibrant teenager who played soccer and complained about his homework. With the burden of debt lifted, Ilara had focused on her career. She was now the head nurse of the pediatric cardiac unit at the same hospital. She had undergone extensive therapy, and though she would never sing again, she had regained the ability to speak in a soft, quiet voice. She used it to comfort sick children and their terrified parents. She never used the number on the card Mikhail had given her. She never had to. She kept it, though. Tucked away in a small jewelry box, a reminder of the strange, silent angel who had descended into her life and vanquished her demons. In his quiet study, surrounded by old books and the smell of leather, Arthur Volkov would sometimes look up at the wall above his desk. Amidst the framed photos of his late wife and his estranged daughter, there was another, smaller frame. It did not hold a photograph. It held a small piece of paper, torn from a hospital prescription pad. On it, in neat, careful handwriting, were 2 words. "Thank you." Ilara had sent it to him, through Mikhail, a week after her brother's surgery. It was his most prized possession. It was not a trophy of a victory won. It was a memento. A reminder of a time when he had been given a choice, to remain a silent victim in a hospital bed, or to become the silent protector he was always meant to be. It was a reminder that even in a life filled with darkness, one small act of righteousness could be a light bright enough to guide you home. For in the end, true strength is not measured by the noise you make or the fear you command. It is measured by the silence you are willing to break for those who have no voice, and by the peace you bring to the innocent souls who have been wronged by a loud and violent world. It is the quiet courage to be whatever you need to be, not for yourself, but for someone else.